Welcome, everybody, back to our Emerging Voices in Reese speaker series. We are so happy to be gathered again on this slightly gloomy New Haven Thursday. I hope if you are elsewhere, it is less gloomy as spring quickly approaches. So before I introduce our speaker for this afternoon, I would like to first thank my partners who, without whom this event would not be possible. So thank you to Doug Rogers, Marietta Bojovic, Jeannie Chu, Mina Magda, Christina Andriotis, and Asia Newpain. And I would also like to thank our sponsors for today's event. That would be the Yale program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and the European Studies Council of the Macmillan Center. And last but decidedly not least, a huge thanks to our speaker for today, Alex Moshkin, who is a fellow at the University of Michigan's Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies. Dr. Mushkin received his PhD in comparative literature from the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, he had been a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on multilingual Russian Jewish literature, cinema, and visual art in the late 20th and early 21st centuries in Israel. His current book project, Russian-Israeli Culture in Search of Identity, investigates how Russian-speaking émigrés to Israel created a cultural identity for themselves in sync with the Israeli society. He is also working on an English language anthology of contemporary Russian-Israeli poetry in Hebrew and Russian. His talk today is titled Likhie in Israel, Contemporary Russophone Poets Revisit Their Migration to Israel, which will focus on nostalgia for the Soviet Union in contemporary poetry by the younger generation of Russian émigré writers to Israel produced in the last 10 years. So without further ado, please join me in giving a huge virtual applause for Alex Moshkin. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Spencer. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the organizers to inviting me to this talk. Let me put on some PowerPoint. Okay, so as Spencer noted, today I will be presenting a section of my book project, Russian-Israeli Culture in Search of Identity, which analyzes contemporary Russian literature and culture in Israel as part of the broader context of Russophone cultural production in North America, Europe, and the former USSR. In the book, I examine the works of Dina Rubina, Alexander Goldstein, Alexander Barash, Nathan Sharansky, Alice Bialski, Michael Grobman, and Gali Dana-Zinger, just to name a few, to illustrate how Russian-speaking writers and artists sought to forge a Jewish Israeli cultural identity after immigration to Israel from the cultural tools available to them as members of the Soviet intelligentsia. The section I will be presenting today, the last chapter of the book, centers on the poetry and visual art of the youngest generation of Russian immigrants, artists in Israel, known as the 1.5 generation, a term that was popularized in Israel by Likhie, who is with us today. I'll start with a quote. Second. Back in Russia, my mother was a math teacher. She was respected. But here in Israel, she had to take on double shifts of manual labor just to survive. Of course, this caused extreme loneliness and isolation, but I'm not blaming her. On the contrary, I'm grateful for all the sacrifices she had made for us. At school, no one wanted to talk to me, not even immigrant kids like me. Even our Russian music teacher screamed at me exclusively in Hebrew, though she knew I didn't understand a word of what she was saying. So I learned Hebrew fairly quickly. As a matter of principle, I refused to change my name though. Everything was taken from me, but I wanted to keep my name. I suffered years of mental and physical abuse. I was bullied on a daily basis. The stronger kids were hounding me every day, and nobody did a thing to stop it. Not until my mother came to school and in broken Hebrew screamed at the principal and literally shook the girl who had led the systematic crusade of abuse against me. Then the bullying stopped. These words were written on November 14, 2019 by the 35 years old Eva Weisberg, one of the hundreds of Russian Jewish women and some men who shared their heart-rending stories of immigration to Israel in the 1990s in the Hebrew language Facebook group, Russian Women Without a Sense of Humor. Such stories often accompanied by family snapshots from the USSR, are full of pain, trauma, and bitter disillusionment. Some are minimalist and poetic. Others, like the one I just read, are substantially longer and full of detail. What unites them is the tremendous degree of suffering that underscores each testimony of migration. So what triggered this rapid outpouring of traumatic memories by post-Soviet men and women who immigrated to Israel almost 3 decades earlier? The year when the stories appeared might give us a clue. In 2019, Israel celebrated the 30th anniversary of the mass migration that had brought 1 million Russian-speaking Jews to Israel. All year long, Israeli newspapers were filled with stories of doctors and scientists who had successfully integrated into the job market, software engineers who had contributed to the meteoric rise of the high-tech industry, writers and artists who had achieved tremendous success both at home and abroad, and athletes who had won Israel several much-coveted Olympic medals. In other words, the media presented an alluring portrait of a model minority, attended by the often repeated phrase, "Ha'aliyah הכי טובה שהייתה לנו," the best migration wave we ever received. And many Israelis, especially of Soviet extraction, were seduced by this flattering image. The one-sided focus on communal success, however, had the unintended effect of silencing all narratives that did not fit into the media's adulatory portrayal. In this respect, the sudden eruption of historical accounts by Weisberg and others could be seen as an attempt to tell a different story about the Russian-Israeli community and formulate a more nuanced understanding of its first years in the country. The dissonance between Israel's official history and personal memory provokes the central questions of this talk. Now, nearly 30 years after the arrival of Russian-speaking Jews to Israel, the question remains, how should this history be narrated? Should it be remembered in the Zionist key as a story of homecoming in which post-Soviet Jews had found refuge in their ancestral land after years of Soviet persecution? Or, on the contrary, should life in Israel be recalled as a story of hardship, intolerance, and hostility, the way it has been inscribed in a score of Facebook posts like the one I started this talk with? And finally, how does this population's nostalgia for the USSR relate to the uneasy adjustment to life in Israel in the 1990s? To answer this questions, I examine how Russian Israeli writers and painters of the 1.5 generation who were born in the former USSR but resettled in Israel in their teens, including Alex Likhie, Kogan, and Zoya Cherkassky-Nnadi, confront the prehistory of Jews in the USSR and their post-migration period in Israel in the 1990s. In their words from 2014 to 2020, they present an assault on Israel's ideological narrative of Aliyah, which frames immigration to Israel as the triumphalist homecoming of Jews to their ancestral homeland. Extending from 1990s to the new millennium, the poetry by Brief and Kogan and visual art by Cherkassky-Nnadi suggests that for many Russian-speaking Jews in Israel, the desired happy ending was never achieved. Moreover, these artists also present a modification to the Cold War era narrative of the Jewish experience in the USSR as a series of catastrophes and disasters. Instead of overemphasizing anti-Semitism, discrimination, and repression, They depict the last years of the Soviet regime with tenderness, longing, and nostalgia. I conclude by suggesting that this dialectical recourse to nostalgia derives in large part from the rapid downward social mobility that the Russian-speaking community experienced during the roaring 90s in Israel. The leading voice of the Russian-Israeli 1.5 generation is Alex Likhie, a poet who immigrated to Israel from Ukraine in 91 at the age of 5. Her first book of poetry, Tipshonet Mishtarin, Silly Girl of the Regime, sold nearly 500 copies prior to its official release in December 2018, which in the context of Israel and poetry is quite impressive. Apart from being a poet, Brief is also an advocate of Russian-Soviet culture in Israel, organizing cultural and social projects intended to bridge the gap between the country's Russian and Hebrew speakers. One of these, Israel Novi God, seeks to introduce to local Israelis the secular and non-Christian nature of the Soviet holiday of Novi God, Russian for New Year. Another, Operation Veteran, works to transmit the stories of Jewish Red Army soldiers during World War II and frame them as part of the collective Jewish history during the era of the Holocaust. And finally, Rafe organizes the ongoing poetry series, Tusovka Immigration Poetry, which invites writers to read their works that deal with the experience of migration to Israel. And in fact, all the poems that I'll be discussing here today appeared in the Tusovka evenings throughout the years. Despite these achievements, the historical narrative of migration that Rafe articulates into poetry is the deeply negative one. This is somewhat surprising, considering her own outstanding success over the years. She completed a BA in Business and Political Science, an MA in Public Policy from the Hebrew University, secured a lucrative job in the Ministry of Economy, and is now a well-known poet and activist. Nevertheless, the narrative of immigrant upward mobility is totally missing from her autobiographical verse. For example, the poem Yevgeny captures the early struggles of the members of the 1.5 generation, whose painful encounter with Israeli society started as early as kindergarten. The poem goes, "The day Yevgeny arrived in kindergarten, the sun shone. He was smaller than me, paler than me, and he smelled of fear. This time, it was I who explained to him in ordered Hebrew words that socks and sandals is, ugly, that a herring sandwich is, stinks, and that he should speak Hebrew. This is not Russia. The day Yevgeny arrived in kindergarten, I was truly happy." So through irony, the poem explores the cyclical nature of violence against Russian newcomers, this time inflicted by émigrés themselves and their peers. The poem seems to suggest that the only way to assimilate to the Israeli collective is by violently repudiating one's Russian identity, here manifested in wearing sandals with socks or eating pickled herring sandwiches, and more generally adopting the anti-Russian stance of the surrounding society. The speaker relishes every moment of bullying poor Yevgeny, cataloging all the things Yevgeny must and must not do in his adopted country. The stylization of the imperfect speech of the narrator, amplified by the how to say and how to tell asides, magnifies the irony of her demand for Yevgeny to speak Hebrew, because this is not Russia, a hegemonic demand most Russian speakers heard in their first years in the country. By the end of the poem, the speaker is truly happy, because after a long period of suffering and humiliation, this is the first time she had assumed the position of power and agency. The dramatic irony here is that the speaker's innocent tone suggests she may not be even aware of the violence she inflicts on Yevgeny, reflecting the tragic fact that the history of violence against oneself does not necessarily lead to future compassion. This idea that traumatization of self often leads to re-traumatization of others reminds me of the scene from the graphic novel Maus by Art Spiegelman, where the grandfather, after all he had suffered at Auschwitz during the Holocaust, nevertheless refuses to pick African-American hitchhikers because he's convinced that they're all thieves. So, in addition to giving voice to the challenging social adjustment of your own generation, Reeve's poetry also brings into open the immigrant traumas of the older generations, experiences that are rarely articulated in Israeli public sphere, especially in Hebrew. For instance, consider the poem Chalom Chozer, Recurrent Dream. My mother told me that when we immigrated to Israel and the financial situation was tough, she sold her body to men. In other words, my mother did not work as a house cleaner. My mother was a whore. And I was shocked, not by the transaction itself, because if you can sell your soul, you can sell your body, but by her demand for a fair wage from someone who fucks her in the ass. My mother was not a stinking Russian. My mother was a liberal with explosive sexuality and a forbidden desire. My mother was a whore. In this sexually explicit poem, Reeve confronts issues related to the adaptation of her parents' generation to life in Israel. Presented from the point of view of the daughter, the poem describes the precarious situation of the mother by casually implying that during the 1990s, there were only two options available for Russian-speaking women, either house cleaning or sex work. The title of the poem, Recurrent Dream, further undermines Israel's ideological narrative of repatriation and its aspirational nature. Instead of presenting Israel as a promised land or the material realization of an ideal, the poem stages it as an ultimate source of trauma, a place where Russian speakers are reduced to mopping floors and engaging in sex work just to survive. Spatially, a vertical movement downwards frames the poem, starting at the heights of Aliyah, which in Hebrew means both immigration to Israel and ascendance, implying ascendance to heaven, and ending in the depths of being fucked in the ass. The polysemantic Hebrew word tachat, which means both ass and lowest point, captures the vertical trajectory of the mother's journey from the peak of repatriation to the nadir of prostitution. The trajectory suggests disillusionment and the story of a fall, rather than the triumphant arrival in the promised land, thereby reversing the entrenched narrative by dissident and refusnik authors who present Israel as the endpoint of their spiritual journey from the Soviet underworld to the Israeli Holy Land. And we can think of many memoirs and novels like this, for example, Natan Sharansky's. The expectation that the speaker is going to be shocked by her mother's revelation, however, is undermined in the second stanza. Instead, what surprises the speaker is her mother's audacious demand for a fair wage. This act of social protest from the vulnerable position of victimhood actually inspires the daughter and serves as a model for the daughter's own activism. Instead of repressing this past, the speaker takes ownership of the traumatic history of her parents' generation and proudly uses it as a template for her own activism and defiance. Instead of being ashamed, the speaker takes the established stereotype of Russian whore, Zona Russia, ubiquitously hurled at Russian-speaking women in Israel during the 1990s, and relieves it of its pejorative stigma through an appeal to an alternative liberal narrative of agency, explosive sexuality, and forbidden desire. However, this narrative of agency somewhat contradicts the poem's initial assertion that the mother was plunged into sex work because of financial difficulties. Therefore, the cathartic last line, "my mother was a whore," is ambiguous there, and can be read both as a way to reclaim the pejorative term, but also as a scream of desperation. Rita Kogan is another prominent and critically acclaimed Soviet-born Hebrew language poet of the 1.5 generation. She was born in Leningrad in 1976 and immigrated to Israel in 1990 when she was 15 years old. To date, she published 2 full-length books of poetry, Rishayon L'Shgiot Ktiv, License to Misspell, and Sus B'Chatzait, Horse in a Skirt, which was the runner-up for the prestigious Gardner-Simon Prize for Hebrew Poetry. She also produced several iconic translations of Russian poetry into Hebrew, including that of Anna Akhmatova, Marina Tsvetaeva, Osip Mandelstam, Joseph Brodsky, and Alexander Pushkin. Because Kogan arrived in Israel at a much later age than Reeve, her poetry focuses less on childhood and more on the challenges that women experience in immigration. For instance, let us look at Kogan's poem, Agdarat Smith, 2015, self-definition. You don't look like you're from here. You don't look like you're from there. Why are you cold? Aren't you Russian? Why are you hot? Aren't you Israeli? Wow, you don't have an accent. Actually, you do have an accent. Are you Jewish? On both sides? How long have you been in Israel? 20 years and still haven't got used to it? Where are you from? I mean, from here. I mean, from there. You leftist? Weird. You're Russian. Do you have a boyfriend? No? Weird. You're Russian. You won't fuck me? No, but you're Russian. You fucked them already? Sure, you're Russian. The poem, structured as a series of intrusive questions that are hurled at Russian-speaking women, presents an intersectional critique of oppressive societal expectations towards immigrant women who, even after 20 years in the country, are judged to be unable to fit the norms of the Israeli society. The increasingly aggressive questions reveal the frequency of the sexual and verbal harassment that women with Russian accent experience, as well as the scrutiny to which their sexuality, ethnicity, cultural identity, and even bodily reaction to temperature are subjected. Regardless of what the speaker does, speak with or without an accent, be cold or hot, sleep or not sleep with your boyfriend, she remains the foreign other and is perceived through the prism of Russian difference. Yet, besides reflecting the harassment of Russian Israeli women, the poem also refracts traditional power dynamics between Israeli men and Russian-speaking women by making the male gaze, instead of a woman's body, the object of interrogation. In so doing, the poem articulates a demand for social and cultural change that would challenge the prevailing norms that makes the harassment of Russian women so widespread and ubiquitous. Ultimately, the historical accounts of the 1.5 generations are unique in their reluctance to celebrate Israel and forget the Soviet past. Seen from the hindsight of the Israeli present, punctuated by humiliation, economic uncertainty, and a violent demand to assimilate, the Soviet past is remembered by some 1.5ers, like the painter I will discuss next, Zoya Cherkassky-Nnadi, as an ideal where life was good and devoid of contradictions. In a certain sense, the historical work of the art by the 1.5 generation corresponds to Svetlana Boym's definition of nostalgia as, I quote, a longing for a home that no longer exists or has never existed, quote. In her seminal study, The Future of Nostalgia, Boyms distinguishes between 2 types of nostalgia, restorative and reflective. While restorative nostalgia is associated with nationalism and its stubborn attempt to rebuild the lost home and patch up the memory gaps, reflective nostalgia is associated with culture and introspection and is perceived as a yearning that, quote, cherishes shattered fragments of memory and delays the homecoming, wistfully, ironically, desperately. In Boehm's terminology, Brief and Kogan's Hebrew language poetry uses reflective yearning for the time before immigration as a way to disrupt Israel's restorative nationalist orientation and to celebrate a multiplicity of cohabitations and effective allegiances. Their poetry, therefore, is not about the Soviet past per se or about Russia's nationalist aspirations. Instead, it is about finding a space for Russian culture and people in Israel's culturally aggressive national space, with clear boundaries of cultural and social inclusion and exclusion. Zoya Cherkassky-Nnadi is the most well-known and critically acclaimed Russian-Israeli artist of the 1.5 generation, working in painting and installation. She was born in 1976 in Kiev, where she attended elementary and secondary school of the arts, and immigrated to Israel at 15. Similar to a cohort of leftist post-Soviet artists from the Russian Federation, such as Kirill Medvedev, Victoria Lamasco, and the collective Что делать, Cherkassky-Nnadi combines her artistic practice with political activism. She's an active participant in the social struggle for the rights of African asylum seekers in Israel, an avid supporter of the Jewish Arab Socialist Political Party, Da'am, which endorses a one-state solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And her art more generally provides a spotlight for the different marginalized groups that are congregated in Israel or hamstrung by the ruthless working of global capitalism elsewhere. Over the years, her art has been presented in major galleries in Israel and around the world, including Tel Aviv, Berlin, Moscow, New York, Vienna, and many other places. 2018, her solo exhibition focusing on Russian immigrants in Israel, Pravda, was displayed for a whole year in Israel's most prestigious art institution, the Israeli Museum, and I actually don't know any solo exhibit that was displayed for such a long time there. And the central themes of the exhibition, prostitution, homelessness, alcoholism, bullying, drug addiction, sexual harassment, and adult circumcision, rhyme with the themes of much of Brief's and Kogan's poetry. In the time that remains, I'll focus on Cherkassky-Nnadi's painting series, Soviet Childhood, because it perfectly illustrates Boehm's idea of reflective nostalgia as a creative instrument of artistic expression. The series, which was first uploaded to Facebook from 2014 to 2018, and then unveiled in the trendy Rosenfeld Gallery in Tel Aviv, and then at Fort Gunsworth Gallery in New York, features over 100 of drawings and paintings that portray a series of childhood memories from the Soviet Union. Here are several key paintings from the series. I'll show you quickly and then I'll focus on specific ones. So the series, I argue, stages moments of a happy childhood in the late Soviet period. Aesthetically, the warm palette and idealized subject matter communicate the love and yearning that are enshrined in these works. Even the style with which Cherkassky-Nnadi chose to render this period is tailored for the subject matter. All the paintings are executed in a childlike manner using markers on paper and sometimes acrylic paint, and drawn in bold, bright, warm colors. As a whole, the series presents harmonious scenes of life and coming of age in what seems like a stable, uniform, and eternal empire. A rather odd characterization of Perestroika and the Gorbachev era. It seems much more fitting for the Brezhnev era, but still. Instead of focusing on anti-Semitism, discrimination, repression, and the economic and social disintegration of the USSR, the major building blocks of dissident and refugic literature, but also the reasons why 1.6 million of Soviet Jews immigrated when Gorbachev opened the borders in '89. Soviet childhood depicts the last years of the Soviet regime with tenderness, longing, and wistfulness. For instance, let's look at the following four paintings. The first that you see in front of you, Grandmother, presents a family ideal. Grandmother is back from a store and the children are delighted by the delicious goods in her klechataya sumka, red, white, and blue bag. Teenage Rebellion presents an affectionate account of the split between the younger and older generation over rock music. The cat is the only member of the family who has not picked sides yet in this intergenerational feud. Karate presents a nostalgic scene of a group of friends drinking alcohol at the playground, with a male suitor showing off his karate skills he had picked up from a recent Perestroika movie. And finally, the Big Brother zooms in on the Soviet kitchen as an intimate family space where food, music, and affection seamlessly coalesce. The ideological slogan, peace to the world, mir mir, that is seen from the window, rings surprisingly true here, collapsing the entrenched opposition between private and public in the Soviet Union. In fact, this picture looks like a wistful redrawing of a still from Little Vera, the most famous Perestroika-era Chernucha film. But instead of Chernucha, we see Little Vera full of nostalgia. So the nostalgia in these paintings is augmented by Cherkassky-Nnadi's exhaustive attention to detail, carefully reproducing the lace dolly under a telephone in Grandmother, the form of Soviet-era blanket covers with a diamond cut on top and the notorious Soviet carpet in Teenage Rebellion, Khrushchev-era building blocks and karate, and the shape of the Soviet-era house slippers, tapachki in the Big Brother. This historical accuracy, evocative of family snapshots, made this series resonate even more strongly with its 300 million former Soviet citizens, many of whom possessed identical household environments due to the centralized nature of the Soviet production. The meticulous attention to detail in representing the Soviet home, clothes, food, atmosphere, and cityscape, therefore, helps to break the picture's fourth wall, enabling Soviet-born viewers to plunge into the scene and identify with what is represented. At the same time, the style with which Cherkassky-Nnadi depicts the lost Soviet Atlantis precludes a straightforward identification with the scenes. Indeed, her use of polychromic representation, warm palette, and signature naivete inscribes the artist in the context of Russian and European neo-primitivism. Like avant-garde artists Natalia Goncharova and Mikhail Larionov and Paul Gauguin a century before her, Cherkassky-Nnadi uses crude lines, flattened perspective, expressionist colors, and focus on simple folk as a way to bring the late Soviet period to life. The depiction of the Soviet period in this hyper-stylized, neo-primitive idiom draws attention to itself and creates a gap between the artist and the material. These paintings, in their exaggerated emotionality, suggest that Cherkassky-Nnadi knows that the past could not have been like this, but nonetheless depicts it as a golden age and a conscious performance of nostalgia. And in so doing, the artist attempts to remedy the trauma of her generation in Israel that was described in Brief and Kogan's poetry in order to reassemble the coherent collective identity from Russian émigrés that was shattered in their encounter with the Israeli society in the 1990s. In contemporary scholarship on post-Soviet nostalgia, Marta Rabikovska argues that, quote, salvaging the remains of communism is traditionally explained either as an ironic nostalgic recall, which is often commercially driven, or as an expression of primitive nostalgic attachment to the ruined past, which is incompatible with a period of transition, end quote. In this vein, Soviet nostalgia is often stigmatized in the post-Soviet critical discussion as atavistic, anti-modern, and opportunistic. It is important to emphasize, however, that one's effective relationship to the past is highly dependent on one's ability to take advantage of opportunities in the post-Soviet present, either in the former USSR or elsewhere. The dismissive understanding of nostalgia risks obfuscating the full complexity of the effective responses of deprivileged populations, which are often lumped under the discourse of nostalgia. Bearing that in mind, Cherkassky-Nnadi's laudatory attitude toward the Soviet past demonstrates how post-Soviet nostalgia could be used as a mobilizing force and a tool for collective identity formation for a community that struggled with its transition to Israel, but also as a way to glean symbolic and economic capital. So I conclude. The unwillingness of artists from the 1.5 generation to depict the Jewish chapter in the USSR in a minor key stems from the fact that as children, they were largely shielded from the forces that fed their parents' anti-Soviet sentiments. Moreover, life in Israel, particularly in peripheral towns where many immigrants settled, was extremely challenging, especially when considered in comparison to Soviet social welfare, extended and funded maternity leaves, centralized housing, annual paid vacations to Sochi, Yalta, or Crimea. Well, the annual paid vacation to Crimea are back, and free higher education. It is not surprising, therefore, that discontent with Israel's neoliberalism and the rapid downward social mobility of the older generation animate the poems and paintings by Brief, Kogan, and Cherkassky-Nnadi. In this regard, consider a Hebrew language interview where Cherkassky-Nnadi explains her attitude toward the Soviet past as generational in nature. My generation did not experience on its skin all the horrors of the Soviet system. For us, the Soviet Union is childhood, and this childhood was very good. Our memories are different from those of the older generations. They're not necessarily related to the Soviet system, but to childhood. Our attitude toward the Soviet Union is calmer and less critical. In contrast to their parents' generation, whose thorny relationship to the USSR resulted in a profound mistrust and animosity toward the Soviet Union and left-wing politics more generally, the younger generation is not interested in beating the dead Soviet horse. Their projects, despite their backward gaze onto the 1980s and 1990s, are not interested in the past per se. Rather, they're using the past to address the present situation of the Russian-speaking community in Israel. As evident in the quote, Cherkassky-Nnadi's romanticized depiction of the Soviet past should be read in the nexus of her generation's drama of resettlement and painful adjustment in Israel. As Likhie and Kogan's poetry demonstrates, after years of having to downplay, renounce, and feel ashamed of their Russianness, the artistic project of 1.5ers show a new readiness to celebrate their history, culture, and identity, and fight for inclusion. Therefore, Cherkassky-Nnadi's steady focus on the positive aspects of the Soviet experience enable fellow 1.5ers to articulate a shared collective identity, whilst the assault on Israel's melting pot policy by Likhie and Kogan allows them to construct a hyphenated Russian-Israeli identity in defiance of monocultural conceptions of the Israeli society. So doing, all three artists contribute to a different configuration of Israeli culture and society, one that is more capable of accepting diverse pasts, political legacies, and cultural and linguistic experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was terrific. So I'm going to offer a few thoughts and some questions, and then feel free to respond to any of that or none of it, and then we'll open up the Q&A to the audience. So your truly fascinating talk, I think, really highlights this unique set of Israeli-Russian responses to the trauma of immigration and assimilation into Israeli society after this sort of later wave of Soviet and then post-Soviet immigration in the late 80s and early 90s. So these three artists you examine, Alex Rief, Rita Gogan, and Zoya Cherkassky-Nnadi, all contribute in different ways to what you call the testimony of migration. And I think that you really convincingly demonstrate this testimony recalls the late Soviet Union with a nostalgia that is instrumentalized for implicitly political purposes and represents this sort of symbolic material resistance to a political and cultural superstructure that sought and in some ways continues to seek to marginalize these artists' cultural, linguistic, national, and gender identities. If that's a sort of fair, quick summation of your project. Of your talk, I should say. And so I'll jump in with I'll offer three questions to start, and then depending on the Q&A, I'll offer a few more. So my first question is sort of related to the historical conditions and the political conditions that enabled these artistic responses in particular, and how they can possibly be seen within the various sort of constantly changing historical relationships between the Soviet Union and Soviet Jews, in particular its efforts at assimilation. Going back to even the early days, right after the revolution, with this sort of very brief establishment of the Commissariat of Jewish Affairs and the Jewish sections of the party, which reshaped specifically Jewish Yiddish institutions to fit within Soviet ideological programs. As V. Gittleman said, Jewish in form, Soviet in content, that was the goal, that was the sort of method of assimilation. At least up until around 1930 or so. And furthermore, these artists in particular, these 1.5 generation artists, are responding to the high cultural capital in Israel that is placed on Hebrew language Jewish culture, which in self can perhaps be read in contradistinction to the cultural capital that was placed on Russian language and culture within the Soviet Union, which I think you begin to discuss perhaps in relation to Alex Rief's work specifically. And so I'm wondering how these artists comment on or draw perhaps more explicit parallels between the political and cultural mechanisms of assimilation and or control that can be found in some way in both the Soviet Union and in Israel. And is there a distinction to be made between the nostalgic relationship that these artists set up with the Soviet Union and historical relationship that may be drawn between the Soviet Union, Israel, and Soviet and post-Soviet Jews? So my second question is a question of genre, in particular documentary. So this is something that is particularly interesting to me. So John Grierson is sort of famous. It's famously called documentary the creative treatment of reality, while also sort of ever emphasizing its social utility, right? Its power to sort of affect real change in society. And it seems that this is a significant part of the projects of all of these artists you're discussing. So we've got these super interesting categories that you set up: Rief's autobiographical verse, Kogan's found footage poetry, which I think is just like the coolest genre that I've come across recently, and the sort of highly stylized yet historically accurate paintings by Cherkassky-Nnadi. So what is the function of documentary, and then on the other hand, the document in these projects? And if these projects are forwarding this sort of fundamentally documentary concern, how exactly do you or may one define document in the context of these highly stylized works of art? This isn't a new question at all in the Russian context, or Russian and then perhaps Soviet, Eastern European, Jewish context. We have things like Anatoly Kuznetsov's novel document, which is also a genre applied to Andrei Sakharov's diaries later on after his death. We have Władysław Schlengel's poem documents. Of course, we have Teatr Dok in Russia today, and all of these sort of these documents with artifice frequently seem to relate to personal and historical trauma. And so then what is the relationship between documentary, art, and trauma in the 1.5 generation and their productions? And my third question that I'll lead with is concerning this question of difference. And so I'm wondering if you could go a bit further in talking about difference. So you most clearly identify this Russian difference, which is indisputable, that these artists all experience. But also considering that all three of these artists who you're talking about are women, what about gender difference? Sort of Barbara Johnson's difference that takes hold in politics, culture, and humanity generally. And also a possible linguistic difference that is perhaps separate from the Russian cultural difference. It seems to me that, I may be wrong, but I believe that all of these artists are native Russian speakers, if that's right. But they're working in Hebrew primarily. but also it seemed like Cherkassky-Nnadi's paintings were all, for the most part, signed in English. And so what do we do with all of that? And then we also have these artists sort of inscribing themselves into Russian literary culture and literary history as well, not only in regard to their original work, but you specifically mentioned that Kogan is translating these Tsvetaeva, Akhmatova, Mandelstam, Brodsky, Pushkin. And so what do we do with that? And so generally, how does multilingualism inform these approaches, and how can it sort of complicate our understanding of the cultural identity that's being asserted on the part of all of these artists?
Wow, thank you so much for this really rich both discussions and questions. I feel like I can talk about, those are huge questions, and I can talk for a really long time about each one of those. So I'll be quick. And let me start with the documentary and trauma. I think the 1.5 generation is a really interesting term, because it both talks about it's a sociological term, which was coined in the 1960s, and it described this intermediary generation, not the first generation, not the second generation. It's a bridge generation of people from the age of 5 to 18, but it's also a Holocaust studies term, 1.5 generation, and it's about child survivors who are writing fiction about in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So I think that this trauma and documentary and art nexus that you identified is really important. And I think the trauma in documenting seems to be like almost a scream of pain for this artist. A highly, of course, stylized scream of pain, right? It is a found footage, but in a way you can see that it's a stylized found footage. There's another visual artist, Russian Israeli, who goes with a hidden camera and actually actually films all the sexual advancements that are made on her on the street, just straight up. So yes, so documenting and trauma and harassment is there. On the parallels between the Soviet Union and Israel, I think the main parallel is this idea that as Jews in the Soviet, that about people who immigrate to Israel and to say something along the lines of, in the Soviet Union, I was a Jew. In Israel, I became a Russian. And Russian here I say with quotes, because it's of course post-Soviet. It's of course not everyone there. First of all, some people would like to be identified as Jews and not Russians. It's inaccurate that half of the people came from Ukraine, because this is where mostly the Pale of Settlement was. So it's, some people are from the Caucasus and have very little to do. They're Sephardi, they have Mizrahi, they have very little to do with Russianness. And so this parallel and this history of discrimination that continues from both in the Soviet Union, I think that's what Cherkassky does so great. She has a few of her paintings depicting life in the other series. Soviet Childhood is very like nostalgia-driven series, but she also has an Israeli series where she puts side by side painting, let's say, of discrimination of what was going on for Jews in the Soviet Union and in discrimination of the same Russian Jews, but in Israel, showing the parallels. So if in the Zionist imaginary, you see a lot of those before and after, right? At first, the exile and the rebirth, right? That's usually dichotomies. But here she says, well, you know, who knows where was worse, as a Jew in the Soviet Union or as a blonde woman in Israel. And the last question that you asked, this is a great idea about multilingual poetics and aesthetics of this artist. And there's much to say. I actually was hoping to present a different paper today I'm working on now, but I didn't have time to complete it. I think you've heard my son screaming. Oh, he's screaming now. That explains it. And this paper is, there's quite an amazing work that has been done recently about the connection between the Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Arabic countries, and Russian Jews. And usually you see this relationship as a story of conflict and hostility, but in the last, but we can also see, at least that's what I want to argue, and some sociologists says, no, actually Russian-speaking Jews moved to the periphery and they actually learned what it means to be Israeli from their Mizrahi neighbors. So there's a lot of cultural intermingling going on between those two groups. And what I want to go further and look at how this group of Mizrahi writers of Ars Poetica, Adi Kesar and others, actually influenced the writers of 1.5 generation. I did some interviews with Kogan, Likhie, and Alec Ebel about this. All of them would go to this evenings of Ars Poetica, and Kogan actually said, like, this is the first time when I actually realized what it means to write poetry, not elitist poetry, but actually poetry of pain. And so they look at the Mizrahi experience and actually learning from them. So I actually think that there's not much Russian cultural influence in the poetry of Likhie, poetry of Kogan. Maybe that's why they're so disliked on the Russian street in Israel, but actually they get a lot of acclaim from the Hebrew audiences because there is something cultural similarity between those two groups. But that would be in my next talk. And we don't have that much time, so let's open up the floor for Q&A. But thank you for your questions.
Thank you for your responses. So we have a question from Masha Spolberg, who asks, such a fascinating talk and beautiful analyses of the poems and paintings. I find it curious that Riv, Kogan, and Cherkassky-Nnadi are all women. I'm curious if there are male voices among the 1.5 generation reflecting on the Soviet Jewish experience in Israel. And if not, why women might be best positioned to be doing this kind of critical reflection.
That is a great question, and you're right. Yes, I'll start with the end. Why women? I think women they're definitely the vanguard of the cultural and social movements that is happening in Israel, and I think there is something to do. I feel like women experience in migration, usually they're doubly burdened. They're doubly burdened both as women and as immigrants in the patriarchal household, for example. When you can read a lot of sociological accounts that when men immigrate, they would be spending a lot of time sitting at home trying to reclaim their profession, while women most of the time go to work immediately and take low-paying jobs to keep the family afloat. So I think this is those experiences that are discussed both in Likhie and Kogan's poetry are really animating this gendered protest. There is a few male voices, and it's so funny, but when Alex Likhie was trying to organize, for example, a circumcision evening of poetry, so poetry that will discuss the experience of adult circumcision, which is a very painful experience for many Soviet Jews involved, and there's many explanations why Soviet Jews were not circumcised in the USSR, and then they ended up doing that in Israel. But I sidetrack here. But even in that evening, half of the speakers were a few of the speakers were women. Alex Likhie has a poetry about circumcision, which is based on her brother's experience, but there's one prominent voice, and that's Alec Ebel. He's both a poet, a spoken word artist, a rapper, musician, and for him, in the few of the poems that describes, he has a song that's called 1990, which is a beautiful account of his immigration experience. And then he has another song poem, Mieni Ma, Who Am I? And this, both of them are talking about the experience of immigration, how he tries to fit in. First he was put in the religious school, and how he realized this conflict between Soviet atheism and Israeli spiritualism. Then how he tried to fit in with the Mizrahi wait, am I here? Can you hear me?
We've got you now. Yep.
Yeah, good. So for some of the artists, some of the writers actually lost their Russian linguistic capabilities when, because of the stigma of being Russian, most of the 1.5ers were trying to erase their Russianness as much as possible, and only started getting back to it in their 30s. And for many of them, it was too late already. Their Russian remained on a rudimentary level, and so yeah. And so this is why in Ebel's poem, she's talking about, well, I was missing too many words in my lexicon by then.
Great, thank you. We're running up on our time here. Do we have any final urgent questions at this point? If so, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A. And if we run out of time, I can forward those to Alex. If not, looks like we're ending right on time. So let's give once again a wonderfully huge virtual applause for Alex. And thank you so much for this truly wonderful talk.
Thank you for coming. It was a pleasure.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.